There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around with them without ever questioning where it came from. It arrived through films, through memorials, through the careful language of political speeches, and the even more careful silences of the men who came home. It is a version that describes the war as a tragedy of misunderstanding, as if the central problem was one of communication, as if the right words delivered at the right moment might have redirected the entire machine of it. That version is comfortable because it places the failure outside the system rather than inside it. It suggests that the people running the war wanted the right things, but simply could not see clearly enough, could not read the terrain, could not anticipate the resilience of an enemy they consistently underestimated. What the actual record shows, assembled from declassified documents, from the testimony of soldiers who were there at every level of command, from the internal memos of generals and secretaries of defense who wrote one thing to each other and said another thing entirely to the public, is that the war was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, deliberately, systematically, and with enough institutional momentum that the misrepresentation eventually became indistinguishable from policy itself. That distinction matters. Misunderstanding implies good faith operating under incomplete information. Misrepresentation implies that the information was there, was read, was understood, and was then set aside in favor of a different story. The Pentagon Papers, which Daniel Ellsberg removed from the Rand Corporation in 1969 and gave to the New York Times 2 years later, did not reveal that American officials were confused about Vietnam. They revealed that American officials knew, in considerable detail, that the war was not going as described, and continued describing it the way they always had. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was writing private assessments as early as 1965 that acknowledged the strategy was not working, that the bombing was not breaking North Vietnamese will, that the body counts were not translating into anything that resembled victory, and he continued standing at podiums and describing progress. That gap between the private knowledge and the public statement is not a gap created by misunderstanding. It is a gap created by choice. Most of the 25 realities that veterans rarely discuss openly today exist inside that gap. They are not secrets in the dramatic sense. They were not classified at the level of nuclear codes or intelligence operations. Many of them were known to journalists, to junior officers, to soldiers who wrote letters home that were read by military censors and sometimes returned with passages blacked out. They were known in the way that things are known in institutions when the institution has decided that knowing them officially would create problems. They became part of the texture of the war rather than part of its official narrative. And when the men who experienced them came home, they often found that the country was not particularly interested in the texture. It wanted the narrative. The narrative was easier to process, easier to argue about, easier to turn into a lesson with a clear moral direction, so they stayed quiet. Not all of them, and not forever, but enough of them, and for long enough, that the texture of what actually happened during those years in Vietnam has remained mostly inaccessible to the general public, buried under decades of retrospective framing that tends to treat the war as either a noble cause betrayed by weak political will or a criminal enterprise that should never have begun. Both of those framings share something important in common. They both require a clear line between the people who made decisions and the decisions themselves. They both require agency to be legible, cause and effect to be traceable, blame to be assignable. The actual experience of the war, as it was lived by the roughly 2.5 million Americans who served there, does not cooperate with either framing. It is considerably messier, considerably more corrosive, and considerably harder to metabolize. The body count was not a secondary feature of the Vietnam War. It was the primary metric of success, and the decision to make it the primary metric changed the nature of the war at every level of the institution. In most conflicts, territory is the measure of progress. You hold a line, you advance a line, you can point to a map and show what has been gained or lost. Vietnam did not work that way. partly by design and partly because the nature of guerrilla warfare in dense terrain made territorial control almost meaningless. You could clear a village and come back 3 weeks later to find it exactly as it had been before you cleared it. You could hold a position at enormous cost and then be ordered to abandon it, because holding it permanently was never the objective. The objective was attrition. The theory, pressed hard by McNamara and by General William Westmoreland, was that if enough enemy combatants were killed, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would eventually run out of the will and the manpower to continue. The body count was the measure of how close you were to that threshold. The problem was that the body count was reported by the units doing the killing, checked by the same chain of command that was being evaluated on the basis of those numbers, and there was essentially no independent verification mechanism. A platoon that came back from an operation and reported 40 enemy killed was not routinely challenged on that number. The number went up the chain, got aggregated with other numbers, and became part of the weekly briefing that Westmoreland gave to journalists in Saigon, the briefing that reporters began calling the 5 o'clock follies, because the numbers being announced bore so little relationship to what correspondents were seeing in the field. Units that consistently reported high body counts were praised. Officers whose units reported lower numbers were sometimes passed over for promotion. The incentive structure pointed in one direction, and it would be naive to think that direction did not affect what got reported. What actually happened is that the counts were inflated, not always, and not by every unit, but enough, and systematically enough, that by the mid-1960s, the inflation had become a structural feature of the reporting system rather than a corruption of it. Civilians who died in operations were sometimes counted as enemy combatants. People who happened to be in a free fire zone were counted. The distinction between a Viet Cong fighter and a Vietnamese civilian was often operationally meaningless, partly because the Viet Cong deliberately did not wear uniforms and moved through the civilian population, and partly because the American military had established free fire zones in which anything that moved could be engaged. In those zones, the question of who was a combatant and who was not was answered by proximity rather than by evidence. If you were there and you were killed, you were counted. Senior officers knew this. There are internal army documents from the late 1960s in which analysts described the body count as an unreliable metric, in which the circular nature of using self-reported numbers to evaluate the performance of the units doing the reporting is identified as a fundamental problem. Those documents existed. They moved through the bureaucracy. They did not change the policy. The policy continued because the body count was not just a military metric, it had become a political one. It was the number that the Johnson administration used to demonstrate progress to the American public, to Congress, to allies who were growing skeptical of the entire enterprise. To abandon the metric would have been to admit that there was no metric, that progress was not being measured because progress was not occurring in any form that could be reliably tracked. That admission was not made until much later, and by then it was buried under the weight of everything else. The rules of engagement changed constantly throughout the war, and not always in the direction of greater restraint. In the early years of American involvement, there were genuine attempts to construct rules that would distinguish between military operations and the mass killing of civilians. Those attempts were not entirely unsuccessful. There were commanders who took them seriously, who understood that the legitimacy of the American presence depended in part on the behavior of American forces toward the civilian population, who recognized that every atrocity committed by an American soldier created more Viet Cong than it eliminated. Those commanders existed. They were not the majority, and they were not operating in a system that consistently rewarded their approach. The establishment of free fire zones, which were officially called specified strike zones, was a policy decision that had enormous consequences for how the war was fought at the ground level. A free fire zone was an area in which the military had determined that the civilian population had been, at least in theory, relocated, and in which any remaining person could be assumed to be hostile. The theory and the practice were not the same thing. Relocating Vietnamese villagers from land they had farmed for generations was not a straightforward operation. Many people did not leave when ordered to. Many left and came back. Many were never reached by the relocation orders. The result was that free fire zones often contained significant numbers of civilians who were there not because they were combatants, but because they had nowhere else to go, or because they were old or sick or unwilling to abandon their ancestral land for a refugee camp that offered nothing except safety from American bombs. In a free fire zone, a soldier did not need to establish that a person was hostile before engaging. The designation of the zone was itself the justification. This created a situation in which the institutional permission to kill existed independently of any individual determination that the target warranted being killed. The psychological weight of that, on soldiers who were operating in those zones day after day, week after week, is something that most clinical discussions of Vietnam veteran trauma significantly underemphasize. It was not just the violence that damaged people. It was the removal of the moral architecture that normally surrounds violence, the architecture that says you kill in self-defense, you kill to protect others, you kill because the person you are killing has presented a specific and immediate threat. In a free fire zone, that architecture was replaced by a geographic designation. The violence was licensed in advance categorically by a line on a map. The village of My Lai is the atrocity that entered the public record because a soldier named Ron Riddenhauer heard about it from men who were there and spent months trying to get someone in the army to investigate before finally writing directly to members of Congress. The investigation that followed, conducted by the army itself, documented the killing of between 300 and 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men, by soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry. Lieutenant William Calley was eventually convicted of murder. He was the only person convicted. He served 3.5 years of house arrest. Every officer above him in the chain of command who knew what had happened and chose not to investigate or report it was either not charged or was acquitted. What is less known about My Lai is that it was not an aberration in the sense of being an isolated event that surprised the people who learned of it. The Army's own investigation, the Peers Commission, documented a systematic effort by officers at multiple levels of command to suppress information about the massacre. Messages were altered. Witnesses were discouraged from coming forward. The official after-action report described the operation as a military success, with enemy killed in action counts that bore no relationship to what had actually happened. The cover-up was not the spontaneous reaction of a few officers trying to protect themselves. It was a coordinated institutional response that involved people at the brigade level and possibly higher. The machinery for suppressing information about civilian casualties was already in place because it had been used before. My Lai was extreme in its scale. It was not extreme in the impulse to conceal it. The Army has never released a full accounting of how many similar incidents occurred during the Vietnam War that were not investigated, not reported, or reported inaccurately. The Toledo Blade won a Pulitzer Prize in 2004 for a series of articles about Tiger Force, a platoon of the 101st Airborne Division that over a period of 7 months in 1967 engaged in a pattern of killings of unarmed civilians that Army investigators documented in a report that was then buried for more than 3 decades. The investigators concluded that 18 members of the unit had committed war crimes. No one was ever charged. The report sat in Army archives until reporters found it. The Army's response when the stories were published was to say that the findings had been reviewed at the time and that no charges were warranted. The psychological screening of soldiers before and during Vietnam was not designed to identify men who might break under the specific kind of moral pressure the war created. It was designed to identify men who were physically capable of service and who did not have diagnosable psychiatric conditions that would interfere with their performance. The Army knew from the Korean War and from World War II that combat exposure caused psychological damage. It had a name for it, a series of names: combat fatigue, shell shock, operational exhaustion, and it had some understanding of the factors that increased the risk, including the duration of exposure, the intensity of combat, the unpredictability of the threat, and the degree of unit cohesion. What it did not adequately account for was the effect of moral injury, the specific kind of psychological damage that comes not from fear, but from participation in or witness of acts that violate one's own moral framework. Moral injury as a clinical concept was not well developed until decades after Vietnam, largely because of the work of Jonathan Shea and others who were treating Vietnam veterans and finding that the standard models of trauma did not fully explain what they were seeing. The veterans who were most damaged were not always the ones who had been in the most intense combat. They were often the ones who had been ordered to do things they knew were wrong, or who had seen things done and said nothing, or who had carried out operations that they understood, in the moment, to be pointless, and had then watched people die for those operations anyway. The damage was not the damage of fear. It was the damage of complicity, of lost integrity, of the slow erosion of the internal structures that normally tell a person what they are and what they will and will not do. The military did not have a framework for treating that kind of damage because acknowledging it would have required acknowledging the conditions that caused it. To say that soldiers were being psychologically destroyed by moral injury would have been to say that the operations they were conducting were morally injurious, that the rules under which they were fighting were creating conditions in which moral injury was structurally inevitable. That was not a statement the institution was prepared to make. Instead, it continued to treat psychological breakdown as an individual failure, as a weakness in a particular soldier, rather than a systemic response to systemic conditions. Men who broke down were sometimes treated, sometimes simply removed from combat and reassigned, and sometimes disciplined. The conditions that broke them remained in place. Drug use in Vietnam was extensive, and the military's official response to it followed the same pattern as its response to most of the uncomfortable realities of the war. The problem was acknowledged when it could no longer be concealed, addressed in ways that treated the symptom rather than the cause, and then described in official communications in terms that substantially understated its scope. By 1970, it was estimated that somewhere between 10 and 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin. The number for marijuana was considerably higher. By some estimates, by the early 1970s, a majority of enlisted men in certain units were using marijuana regularly. These were not estimates made by critics of the war or by journalists with an agenda. They were the findings of military investigators and medical officers who were trying to understand why the army was having the problems it was having. The context matters. By 1970, the morale of the American military in Vietnam had deteriorated to a degree that was genuinely alarming to senior officers. The anti-war movement at home had penetrated the enlisted ranks in a way that had never happened in previous American conflicts. Soldiers were reading underground newspapers, some of which were being produced and distributed by anti-war activists who had specifically targeted military bases. There were documented cases of soldiers refusing orders. There were fragging incidents, which is the term used for the killing or attempted killing of officers and NCOs by their own men, almost always involving fragmentation grenades rolled under a tent or into a bunker. The Army's own records document more than 800 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972. That number is almost certainly an undercount, because the line between a fragging and an incident that could be classified as enemy action or an accident was one that investigators sometimes had good reasons, professional and personal, not to examine too closely. The fragging statistics represent the extreme end of a spectrum of resistance that ran from actual violence all the way down to what soldiers called sandbagging, which meant going through the motions of a patrol without actually conducting one. A unit ordered to sweep a particular area might walk into the jungle, sit down for several hours, and then return and report that the area was clear. This was not rare. It was widespread enough that officers at various levels of command were aware of it and either tacitly accepted it or looked for ways to verify that patrols were actually being conducted without creating the kind of confrontations that might accelerate the breakdown of discipline. The Army's solution in some cases was to attach observers to units, which created its own problems because the observers became visible symbols of distrust, which accelerated the very breakdown of unit cohesion they were meant to address. Westmoreland's strategy of attrition required a constant supply of bodies, and the draft provided them. But the draft was not applied equally across American society, and the inequality of its application was known, documented, and accepted at the policy level. College deferments meant that men from families wealthy enough to send their children to college were systematically underrepresented in the fighting force. The occupational deferments available to men in certain industries and professions extended the same protection to a somewhat broader group. The result was that the burden of the war fell disproportionately on men who were poor, who were less educated, who were black or Hispanic, who did not have the social capital to navigate the deferment system. This was not a secret. It was discussed in Congress, in newspapers, in the public record. It was accepted as a cost of the war, which meant it was accepted as a cost that other people would pay. The racial dimension of who fought and died in Vietnam is something that the standard narrative handles awkwardly, when it handles it at all. Black Americans served in Vietnam at rates roughly proportional to their share of the population, but they were overrepresented in combat units and underrepresented in the support and administrative positions that reduced combat exposure. Early in the war, before the casualties became politically visible, black soldiers actually re-enlisted at higher rates than white soldiers, partly because the military offered economic opportunities and a degree of meritocratic structure that civilian life in a still heavily segregated America did not. By the mid to late 1960s, as the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement created a framework in which the war could be understood as a conflict in which poor black men were being sent to kill poor Vietnamese people on behalf of a government that was simultaneously resisting the extension of full civil rights to its own black citizens, that calculus shifted considerably. Martin Luther King's 1967 speech at Riverside Church, in which he directly connected the Vietnam War to the poverty and racial injustice he had been fighting at home, was treated by the Johnson administration as a near betrayal. Johnson reportedly became furious. The FBI, which had been surveilling King for years, intensified its operations against him. The response was not engagement with the substance of what King was saying, which was that the war was consuming resources and political attention that could have been directed toward the Great Society programs that Johnson had championed and that King had supported, and that the men dying in Vietnam were disproportionately the same men who were being denied equal treatment under the law at home. The response was to treat the speech as a political problem to be managed. The management of political problems through the control of information was a constant feature of how the Vietnam War was administered from Washington. The relationship between the military and the press in Vietnam was fundamentally different from what it had been in World War II and Korea, and the difference created friction that eventually became one of the defining features of how the war is remembered. In earlier conflicts, journalists were largely embedded with the military, dependent on military logistics and communications, and subject to military censorship. The result was a press corps that operated within parameters set by the institution it was covering. In Vietnam, the military did not impose formal censorship on the press, partly because doing so would have created its own political problems, and partly because officials early in the conflict were confident enough in their narrative that they did not think formal censorship would be necessary. That confidence turned out to be misplaced. Photographers and journalists who were physically present at operations filed stories and images that contradicted the official briefings. The photograph of the chief of the National Police shooting a prisoner in the head on a Saigon street in 1968 was not a photograph that the military wanted in American newspapers. The images of the aftermath of My Lai, taken by a military photographer named Ron Haberle, who was embedded with Charlie Company during the massacre and who kept copies of his personal photographs after turning in his official ones, were not images the military released voluntarily. They appeared first in a small Ohio newspaper and then in Life magazine in 1969, more than a year after the massacre occurred. The gap between the event and its public appearance was the gap created by the system working as it was designed to work. The Phoenix program was one of the most significant and least discussed aspects of the American involvement in Vietnam. It was a joint CIA and South Vietnamese government effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political cadres, the tax collectors, the logistics organizers, the local administrators who made it possible for the Viet Cong to operate in the villages. The theory was sound in a military sense. You cannot defeat an insurgency by killing fighters if the infrastructure that recruits, supplies, and organizes those fighters remains intact. The execution was something considerably different from the theory. The program ran from approximately 1965 in its earlier forms through 1972, and its own statistics documented the killing of more than 20,000 people identified as Viet Cong infrastructure, the imprisonment of tens of thousands more, and the defection of a further tens of thousands who were offered amnesty in exchange for cooperation. The problems with the Phoenix program were structural. The identification of individuals as Viet Cong infrastructure was done by South Vietnamese provincial officials and intelligence operatives who had their own agendas, their own personal vendettas, and their own incentives created by a program that rewarded them for producing results. Accusations were made against people who had nothing to do with the Viet Cong by neighbors settling old scores, by local officials eliminating political rivals, by informants who were being paid for information and understood that the quality of the information was less important than its quantity. Torture was used routinely in the interrogation centers, called provincial reconnaissance units, where people who had been identified as Viet Cong infrastructure were taken. The torture was documented by CIA officers who were present, by military advisors who reported what they witnessed, and by congressional testimony in the early 1970s. The CIA's position was that it did not condone torture, but that it could not control what its South Vietnamese partners did. That position was repeated so many times, in so many institutional contexts, that it became a kind of formula for acknowledging without acknowledging. William Colby, who ran the Phoenix program from 1968 to 1971 and later became Director of Central Intelligence, testified before Congress in 1971 that the program had killed approximately 20,000 people. He presented this as evidence of the program's effectiveness. The question of how many of those 20,000 were actually Viet Cong infrastructure, as opposed to civilians who had been denounced by people with ulterior motives or picked up in sweeps that were designed to produce numbers rather than genuine intelligence, is one that the program's own records cannot reliably answer, because the verification mechanisms were not adequate to the task. South Vietnamese officials who reported a certain number of Viet Cong neutralized in their province were not subjected to rigorous independent audits. The incentive structure, again, pointed in one direction. The air war against North Vietnam was presented to the American public as a targeted campaign designed to destroy North Vietnam's capacity to supply and support the forces fighting in the South. The targets were infrastructure, supply routes, fuel depots, industrial facilities, and eventually, in the later years of the war, Hanoi itself. The targeting was described as precise, as discriminate, as carefully calibrated to achieve military effects while minimizing civilian casualties. The reality of precision bombing in the 1960s and early 1970s is that the technology did not support the claims being made for it. Unguided bombs dropped from aircraft flying at altitude in varying weather conditions did not land where they were aimed with anything like the accuracy that official statements implied. The standard circular error probable for bombs dropped in Vietnam, meaning the radius within which half of all bombs would land, was measured in hundreds of feet, not in yards. In an urban or semi-urban environment, that kind of error radius is not compatible with discriminate targeting. The bombing of Cambodia and Laos is a chapter that the official narrative of the Vietnam War handled for decades by simply omitting it. The bombing of Cambodia began in 1969 under President Nixon, was kept secret from the American Congress and public for over a year, and was conducted under a falsified reporting system in which pilots filed false coordinates for their bomb releases so that the official records would show the bombs falling in Vietnam rather than in a neutral country. The operation was called Menu. Its individual phases were called breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, and dessert. The falsification of records was done on orders from the chain of command, which means it was not a corruption of the system. It was the system. The total tonnage of bombs dropped on Cambodia exceeded the total tonnage of bombs dropped by the United States on Japan during all of World War II. The Cambodian countryside was devastated. The civilian casualty figures are disputed and probably unknowable with precision, but estimates by historians and demographers suggest hundreds of thousands of Cambodian civilians died as a result of the bombing. The destabilization of Cambodia, that the bombing contributed to created conditions that the Khmer Rouge exploited in their rise to power. The connection between the American bombing campaign and the subsequent Khmer Rouge genocide is not a direct causal claim, but it is a connection that serious historians of the region take seriously. It does not appear in most American accounts of the war. The Strategic Hamlet Program, which predated significant American ground involvement, was designed by South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem with American support and funding to separate the rural population from the Viet Cong by relocating villagers into fortified settlements. The theory was based partly on British counterinsurgency experience in Malaya, where a similar approach had achieved some success in an environment that was in almost every relevant way different from Vietnam. The Vietnamese peasantry did not want to leave their land, their ancestral graves, their villages. They were often moved by force. The strategic hamlets were frequently under-resourced, under-defended, and penetrated by the Viet Cong regardless. The program was, by the assessment of American advisors who were watching it in the field, largely a failure. Those assessments went up the chain and were set aside in favor of the optimistic reporting that the Diem government was providing to Washington. Diem was assassinated in 1963 in a coup that the Kennedy administration knew about, facilitated through its refusal to intervene and possibly encouraged through back-channel signals to the coup plotters. The documents on the American role in the Diem coup are more complete than they were for many years, and they show an administration that had concluded Diem was a liability who was making the war unwinnable, and that allowed the conditions for his removal to develop without taking steps that would have prevented it. What followed the coup was 2 years of political instability in Saigon, with governments changing multiple times, each one weaker than the last, creating the political vacuum that the Johnson administration eventually filled with American combat troops. The logic was presented as preventing the fall of South Vietnam. The history shows it was also preventing the acknowledgement that South Vietnam, as a viable, independent state with meaningful popular support, may never have existed in the form that the American investment required it to exist. The question of what South Vietnam actually was, as a political entity, was one that American policy consistently refused to examine honestly. The state of South Vietnam was created at the Geneva Accords in 1954, when the French withdrew after their defeat at Dien Bien Phu, and the country was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, pending a national reunification election scheduled for 1956. The election was never held. The Diem government, with American support, refused to participate. The American position was that a free election in Vietnam would produce a result favorable to Ho Chi Minh, who was genuinely popular in the north and had significant support in the south, and that such a result was unacceptable. President Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs that he had consulted widely and believed that if an election had been held at the time of the fighting, Ho Chi Minh would have received approximately 80% of the vote. The election was therefore prevented, and the provisional division was treated as a permanent border, and the fiction that South Vietnam was a sovereign nation defending its independence against northern aggression was constructed on that foundation. That fiction required constant maintenance. The South Vietnamese government's relationship with its own population was one of the central problems of the American military strategy. The theory of counterinsurgency, as it was understood by the American advisors who had read their Bernard Fall and their David Galula, required a government that had legitimate authority and genuine popular support. Without that, the military effort was treating symptoms while the disease continued to spread. The advisory effort in the early years was partly designed to build that kind of government capacity, and the advisors who were most deeply engaged with the problem were the ones most likely to write honest assessments of how badly it was going. Those assessments, if they were honest, tended to be received poorly by the chain of command, which had its own reporting requirements and its own relationship with Washington's expectations. John Paul Vann was one of the most significant figures in the Vietnam advisory effort, and his story illustrates the structural problem clearly. Vann was an Army lieutenant colonel who served as a senior advisor to South Vietnamese forces in the early 1960s, who watched the Battle of Ap Bac in 1963, in which a South Vietnamese force with significant American support and air cover was unable to defeat a much smaller Viet Cong unit and suffered serious casualties while the Viet Cong escaped, and who filed an after-action report that described in considerable detail the failures of South Vietnamese leadership, the poor performance of the units, and the inadequacy of the American advisory effort. His superiors suppressed the report and gave the battle a positive spin in their own accounts. Vann went to journalists, including David Halberstam of the New York Times, and gave them a more honest account. He was forced out of the army. He returned to Vietnam as a civilian contractor and eventually as a senior civilian official, and continued to be one of the most acute observers of why the strategy was not working, and continued to be largely ignored by the people whose strategies were not working. The American soldiers who served in Vietnam were not a uniform group, and the experience of the war varied enormously depending on when a soldier was there, where they were, what unit they were in, and what their MOS, their military occupational specialty, assigned them to do. About 1/3 of the men who served in Vietnam were in combat specialties and saw significant fighting. The other 2/3 served in support roles, in logistics, administration, communications, medical and other functions that were essential to the operation of the war, but that bore little resemblance to the combat experience that most representations of Vietnam describe. The war that is depicted in film and in most popular accounts is the war of the grunt, the infantryman walking through the jungle. That is a real war. It is also a partial one. The experience of the infantryman in Vietnam was shaped by a rotation policy that was designed to distribute the burden of combat, but that had significant unintended consequences for unit cohesion and effectiveness. Each soldier was assigned to a 12-month tour, after which he rotated home. Officers typically served 6 months in a combat command before rotating to a staff position. The theory was that this was equitable, that it spread the risk, that it would reduce the psychological damage of extended combat exposure by creating a defined endpoint. The practice created units in which the most experienced soldiers were constantly rotating out, just as less experienced soldiers were rotating in, which meant that at any given time, a significant portion of a unit was in the early weeks of their tour when they were most likely to make mistakes, and that the institutional memory of how to operate in a particular area was always being lost and rebuilt. It also meant that the most experienced, most capable soldiers, the ones who had survived long enough to understand the environment, were removed from the unit at the moment they were most valuable to it. The 6-month command tour for officers had a particularly corrosive effect. Officers needed time in a combat command for their career advancement, and the system ensured they got it. What it did not ensure was that they stayed long enough to develop genuine competence in the specific conditions of their area of operations. 6 months was often enough time to get people killed while learning, and not quite enough time to fully apply what had been learned before rotating out. The Army was aware of this problem. There were internal debates about the rotation policy throughout the war. The policy was not changed in any fundamental way, partly because changing it would have required acknowledging that the original policy had been wrong, and partly because the career advancement functions it served were deeply embedded in the institutional culture. Psychological operations, the effort to influence the beliefs and behavior of the Vietnamese population and the enemy forces, received enormous resources and produced results that were routinely misrepresented in the same way that military results were misrepresented. Leaflet drops, radio broadcasts, loudspeaker operations, the Chiu Hoi open arms program that offered amnesty to Viet Cong who defected, all of these produced numbers. Numbers of leaflets dropped, numbers of broadcasts made, numbers of people who defected through the Chiu Hoi program. The numbers were large. They were reported to Washington as indicators of progress. The connection between the numbers and actual changes in Vietnamese behavior or beliefs was rarely examined seriously, because examining it seriously would have required a kind of ethnographic and sociological research that neither the military nor the CIA was well positioned to conduct quickly, and because the results of that research, to the extent it was attempted, were generally not encouraging. The Vietnamese villager who picked up an American leaflet promising safety and prosperity to those who supported the Saigon government and then looked at the village around him, at the corruption of the local officials, at the arbitrary nature of the security operations that swept through regularly and took people away without explanation, at the taxes being collected by both the government and the Viet Cong, at the physical destruction of the landscape by American ordnance, that villager was processing a reality that the leaflet was not addressing. The gap between the promise and the reality was not something that could be closed by better leaflet design or more broadcast hours. It was something that could only be closed by a different underlying reality, and the underlying reality was not being changed in the direction the leaflets described. The corruption of the South Vietnamese government and military was not a secret at any level of the American advisory effort. It was one of the most consistently documented problems in the entire archive of American reporting from Vietnam. Money that was allocated for village development programs, for resettlement assistance, for the construction of schools and medical facilities disappeared into the pockets of officials at multiple levels of the Vietnamese bureaucracy. American military aid, weapons, ammunition, equipment appeared on the black market and sometimes made its way to the Viet Cong. Officers purchased their commands. NCOs purchased their promotions. The draft in South Vietnam was subject to the same kind of manipulation that the American draft was, but with the additional dimension that bribery was a routine mechanism for avoiding service. American advisors who documented this corruption were in a difficult position. Reporting it accurately meant reporting that one of the central premises of the American strategy, that South Vietnam could be built into a viable, self-sufficient state capable of defending itself, was being systematically undermined by the behavior of the government and military that strategy depended on. That was not a report that was received with interest by superiors whose advancement depended on the strategy being viable. The response to honest reporting about South Vietnamese government corruption was often to soften the language, to suggest that the situation was improving, to note the positive examples alongside the negative ones in a way that created an overall picture of a problem being addressed rather than a problem that was structural and resistant to address. The fall of Hue during the Tet Offensive in January 1968 produced one of the most significant and most inadequately processed events of the entire war. Tet was itself a watershed, the moment at which the credibility gap between what the administration was saying and what was happening became visible to a large segment of the American public in a way that could not be managed. General Westmoreland had spent late 1967 on a public relations tour of the United States, describing progress, describing the light at the end of the tunnel, describing an enemy that was being steadily degraded by the attrition strategy. Then, simultaneously, on the night of January 30th and 31st, 1968, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including the grounds of the American Embassy in Saigon. The attacks were eventually repelled, at enormous cost to the attacking forces, but they demonstrated beyond any possibility of honest denial that the claims of progress had been wrong. In Hue, the cultural capital of Vietnam, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces occupied the city for 25 days before being driven out in brutal urban combat. During the occupation, they conducted systematic killings of people they identified as enemies, including South Vietnamese government officials, military officers, police, teachers, priests, and civilians who had any identifiable connection to the Saigon government or to foreign institutions. The mass graves discovered after the city was retaken contained somewhere between 2,700 and 6,000 bodies. The exact number remains disputed. The killings at Hue were real. They were documented. They were atrocities. They were also used by American officials and by subsequent apologists for the war to create a retrospective moral equivalence that obscured rather than clarified the overall picture. What the killings at Hue showed was that the violence of the war was not a monopoly of any one party to it. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese committed atrocities. American forces committed atrocities. The South Vietnamese government committed atrocities. This fact was known during the war and was consistently handled by all parties in the same way, which was to document carefully and publicize loudly the atrocities committed by the other side, while managing and minimizing the documentation and publicity of one's own. That is not a unique feature of the Vietnam War. It is a feature of all wars. What made Vietnam different was the degree to which the managing and minimizing eventually failed, and the degree to which, when it failed, the institutional response was to continue managing and minimizing rather than to revise the underlying approach. The treatment of prisoners of war is an area where the official record and the actual record diverge significantly in both directions. American prisoners of war in North Vietnam were treated in ways that violated the Geneva Conventions. Torture was systematic. The stories that returned prisoners told of the Hanoi Hilton and the other prison camps, of years of solitary confinement and physical abuse, are well documented and are a legitimate and important part of the war's history. They are also the part of the prisoner of war history that received the most official attention and public discussion for reasons that are not difficult to understand. The treatment of prisoners by American forces and by the South Vietnamese government and military is a substantially less discussed subject. The requirements of the Geneva Conventions applied to American forces in Vietnam, and there were American officers who understood this and attempted to enforce compliance. There were also systematic problems. South Vietnamese facilities where prisoners were held were often brutal environments. American advisors were present at these facilities and knew what was happening. The tiger cages of Con Son Island, which were underground cells in which prisoners were confined in conditions that prevented them from standing upright, that were exposed to lime dropped from above, that produced severe physical deterioration, were discovered by a congressional delegation in 1970. Their existence was not unknown to American officials before that discovery. They were a South Vietnamese facility, which created the same institutional formula that applied to the Phoenix program and to other aspects of joint operations. American officials did not condone what was happening. American officials also did not take effective steps to stop it. The question of what happened to the Vietnamese civilian population over the course of the war, in terms of casualties, displacement, and long-term damage, is one that American accounts of the war have never fully engaged with. Estimates of Vietnamese civilian deaths vary widely depending on methodology and source, but credible historical assessments suggest that somewhere between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese civilians died as a direct result of the war, in addition to the military deaths on all sides. The displacement figure is larger. By some estimates, the majority of the rural population of South Vietnam was displaced from its home at some point during the war. Entire regions of Vietnam were depopulated by military operations, by bombing, by strategic relocation programs, by the simple fact that living in a free-fire zone or an active combat area became incompatible with survival. The physical environment of Vietnam was also a casualty in ways that took decades to become fully visible. Agent Orange and the other herbicides used in Operation Ranch Hand, the defoliation campaign that ran from 1962 to 1971, were applied across an enormous area of South Vietnam and parts of Laos and Cambodia. The stated purpose was to deny cover and food supplies to enemy forces. The actual effect was the destruction of millions of acres of forest and farmland, the contamination of soil and water with dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known, and the exposure of enormous numbers of Vietnamese civilians and American servicemen to that contamination. The health effects, cancers, birth defects, neurological damage, emerged over decades. The American government acknowledged a connection between Agent Orange and certain health conditions in veterans, reluctantly and after years of litigation, and eventually established a compensation system. The connection between Agent Orange and the health of the Vietnamese population, who were exposed to far greater concentrations over far longer periods, was acknowledged much later and much more partially. The Dow Chemical Company and Monsanto, which produced the herbicides used in Vietnam, had internal documents from the early 1960s indicating that the dioxin contamination in their products was a known problem and that its health effects were a concern. Those documents were not shared with the government or with the public. The company's position, maintained for decades through litigation, was that the health effects had not been established with sufficient scientific certainty to justify the changes in production that would have reduced the dioxin content. The scientific uncertainty was real, in the sense that establishing causation from environmental contamination to specific health outcomes is methodologically difficult. It was also managed, in the sense that the companies funded research that tended to produce findings of insufficient certainty while disputing research that found otherwise. The veterans who came home from Vietnam entered a society that was in the process of deciding what to think about the war, and found that none of the options being debated bore much relationship to what they had experienced. The anti-war movement often directed its hostility toward the soldiers themselves in ways that were counterproductive and unjust. The image of returning veterans being spat upon by protesters is largely a myth, as sociologist Jerry Lemke documented in considerable detail. But the emotional reality of returning to a country that did not want to think about you or the war you had been sent to fight was real enough. The welcome home parades of World War II were not available for Vietnam veterans, not because people hated them, but because the war was still going on, because it was politically and socially contested in a way that made public celebration impossible, and because the country's dominant emotion about Vietnam by the early 1970s was something closer to exhaustion and shame than anything that could be organized into a parade. The Veterans Administration, which was supposed to provide health care and support to returning veterans, was chronically underfunded and organizationally inadequate to the scale of what it was facing. The number of Vietnam veterans who came home with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was enormous, and the VA did not have the capacity, the trained personnel, the appropriate treatment frameworks, or the institutional understanding to provide them with adequate care. PTSD itself was not recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, when it was added to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, largely because of advocacy by Vietnam veteran groups and by the clinicians working with them who argued, correctly, that the existing diagnostic categories did not adequately describe what they were seeing. The recognition was a clinical advance. It came a decade too late for the veterans who had been cycling through VA facilities since the early 1970s, receiving inadequate diagnosis and inadequate treatment. The homeless veteran population in the United States is substantially composed of Vietnam veterans, and this is not coincidental. The combination of untreated psychological trauma, substance use disorders that developed as self-medication for that trauma, interrupted education and career development, social isolation, and the particular difficulty of functioning in civilian society after extended exposure to violence, created a population that was extremely vulnerable to long-term social marginalization. The VA and the broader veteran services system were not designed for this population. They were designed on the model of the World War II veteran who came home from a comprehensible war with clear moral framing, who integrated relatively smoothly into a society that was economically expansive and socially supportive of veterans, and who generally did not present the particular constellation of problems that Vietnam veterans presented. The Vietnamization policy announced by Nixon in 1969 was presented as a strategy for enabling South Vietnamese forces to take over the fighting and allowing American forces to withdraw. The idea was not new. It was a version of what American advisors had been attempting with limited success for nearly a decade. The difference was the political pressure driving it. The anti-war movement, the casualties, the deterioration of morale in the military itself, the economic costs of the war, all of these were creating conditions in which withdrawal was becoming politically necessary regardless of what was happening on the ground. Vietnamization gave the withdrawal a strategic framing that was more palatable than simply saying the war could not be won and the troops were coming home. The South Vietnamese military's performance during the Vietnamization period was mixed. There were South Vietnamese units that fought with considerable effectiveness and courage, and there were units that did not. The Easter Offensive of 1972, in which North Vietnamese forces launched a major conventional invasion across the demilitarized zone, showed both. South Vietnamese units in some areas broke and ran. In other areas they held, with American air support that was essential to preventing a collapse. The peace agreement signed in Paris in January 1973 was described by the Nixon administration as peace with honor, a phrase that Nixon's own national security advisor Henry Kissinger used while privately believing, according to his own later statements, that the agreement would give South Vietnam perhaps a year or two before the North Vietnamese resumed offensive operations. The phrase peace with honor was, in the context of what Kissinger knew when he used it, a piece of language that prioritized domestic political consumption over honest description. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 was not a surprise to the people who had been watching Vietnam closely. It was a surprise to the American public because the public had been told again and again by successive administrations that the situation was stable, that Vietnamization had produced a capable South Vietnamese military, that the peace agreement had created conditions that could be sustained. None of those things were true in the way they had been described, and the images from the roof of the American embassy, the helicopters, the crowds, the desperate scramble, were images of a reality that had been maintained against the evidence for years, finally becoming impossible to maintain. The accounting of what happened to the men and women who served in Vietnam is still incomplete in several specific senses. The question of prisoners of war and soldiers listed as missing in action remained a source of profound pain and political controversy for decades, and the resolution of individual cases was complicated by the fact that the Vietnamese government had its own interests in how and whether it cooperated with American accounting efforts, and by the fact that the MIA issue became entangled with domestic American politics in ways that sometimes prioritized symbolic and political functions over the practical work of accounting. The families of the missing were sometimes given hope that was not supported by evidence and sometimes denied information that was available. The official processes were slow, underfunded, and bureaucratically complicated in ways that added to the grief of people who'd been waiting for answers for years or decades. The chemical and physical legacy of the war in Vietnam continues to affect the country. Unexploded ordnance, the bombs and shells and mines that were dropped or fired and did not detonate, continue to kill and injure Vietnamese civilians decades later. The United States dropped an estimated amount of ordnance on Vietnam that included several 100 million cluster munitions, small submunitions designed to scatter over a wide area and explode. Cluster munitions have a significant dude rate, meaning a significant percentage of them do not explode on impact and instead remain in the soil, in fields, in the edges of forests, waiting. The estimates of how many unexploded submunitions remain in Vietnam are in the hundreds of millions. They are found by farmers plowing their fields, by children playing, by people who simply move through the landscape without knowing where the boundaries of an old free fire zone were located. They continue to kill and maim. The American contribution to clearance efforts was minimal for decades, partly because acknowledging the scale of the unexploded ordnance problem would have required acknowledging the scale of the bombing, and partly because it was complicated by political and diplomatic sensitivities. The normalization of relations between the United States and Vietnam in 1995 opened the door to more cooperation on these issues, but the pace of clearance is such that the problem will not be resolved for generations. The war in Vietnam ended for the United States in April 1975. For Vietnam, it had not ended in 1975 either. In 1978, Vietnamese forces invaded Cambodia and overthrew the Khmer Rouge government, drawing Vietnam into an occupation that lasted until 1989. In 1979, China invaded Vietnam in what became known as the Sino-Vietnamese War, a brief but bloody conflict that resulted from the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia and from broader geopolitical tensions. Vietnam had been at war, in one form or another, for decades, and it continued to be at war for more than a decade after the Americans left. This context does not appear in most American accounts of the Vietnam War, because American accounts of the Vietnam War are organized around the American experience of it, which ended in 1975, and because the subsequent history of Vietnam is inconvenient for several of the narratives that have been built around the American withdrawal. The men who made the decisions that sent 2.5 million Americans to Vietnam, who constructed and maintained the official narrative, who suppressed honest reporting, who continued the war after the internal assessment showed it was not working, who dropped millions of tons of bombs on civilians, who authorized programs that tortured people and called it counterinsurgency. Most of them lived full lives. McNamara published a memoir in 1995 in which he acknowledged that the war had been wrong, that he had known it was wrong while conducting it, and the book was a sensation for a period, and then it was absorbed into the general archive of regret that surrounds the war. He died in 2009 at the age of 93. The soldiers who followed orders, and the civilians who were bombed, and the villages that were burned, and the children whose parents never came back from operations, and the veterans who came home to insufficient care, and the families who waited for men who were listed as missing, and the Vietnamese who continue to find unexploded ordnance in their fields, have their own accounting, which is not organized around regret or vindication or the lessons that might be drawn for future policy. It is organized around what happened, which continued after the purpose was gone, which continued after the belief was gone, which continued because the machinery of it had its own momentum, and the institutions that ran it had their own needs, and the alternative of stopping, of acknowledging in a complete way what had been done and what had been lost, was always more costly than continuing, right up until the moment it was not. In 1975, after the last American helicopters lifted off from Saigon, the war in Vietnam continued. It continued without Americans, and then it continued in other forms, and the land absorbed what had been done to it, and the people who remained began the process of living in what was left. The accounting of what was done was partial, and remains partial. The records that would complete it are in archives in Washington and Hanoi, and in the memories of the people who were there and who are still alive, and they will not all be assembled before those people are gone.